Hello everyone, welcome here to the book show. I must tell you I'm having fun to actually talk about these books, but it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. I worked out it's going to take me at least 3 months to record all the videos. And it's going to take you at least a year and a half to see all of them, even if they come out every week. And the book I want to talk to you about today is actually one which we sort of discussed already, in the sense that there is a short video out on it, as well as its sister's book, I suppose. There's two of them. They should be free. Whether I will write the third one, I just don't know. At this stage, I might or I might not. It depends on time, depends on how I feel. Anyway, the book which I'm talking to you today is this one, When Does It End? As I say, we did speak to it, when does it end, as well as where does it end. There's a short video about 10-15 minutes which I made for basically to put inside other videos on legacy conversations as sort of as an ad. It didn't really explain that much of the books. I think every book deserves its own episode, own lecture, if you want to call it that. And it's quite a substantial book, as you can see. It's more than 400 pages, 415 around about there. Now, the book, When Does It End? And it's over the book following it, Where Does It End? As well as the third one is Why Did It End, which isn't written yet. But as I said, I'll see if I want to write it or not. We all basically deal with the Jewish army. Now, the Jewish army has got nothing to do with the Israeli Defense Forces, absolutely nothing. This is a Jewish organization which came into being during the Second World War. I'll give you some more details when we go into the details. Right now, I'm just giving you an overview of the book. And they decided to start rescuing themselves from occupied Europe, which you will understand that the Jews at that stage were in great danger there because the Nazis were actually hunting them down. And don't make a mistake in thinking that everybody was, trying to hide people like Anne Frank and her dad. Even they got betrayed at the end. So there will always be, we saw this with a great illness of a few years ago, that you're always going to find most of society actually willing to betray you. Yes, most people will actually do the right thing. That's how they think. And then they will run to the police and say, I've got a Jew there, there's a Jew living there, or there's a guy who's not wearing a mask. And things like that. Yeah, they will do that. It's human nature. Even the law actually admit that. The law will say to you that your own life is worth more than anybody else's life. That came from an interesting court case where a guy stole a horse to escape a flood. And they almost hanged him. But the court actually said, no, you know what, he was acting in distress. There was actually a flood coming, and therefore his behavior, even though not right in the normal sense of a word, under normal conditions, can be excused. So you understand what I mean? There's really not a lot of people who's willing to lay down their lives for other people, and especially not people they don't know. And this is just a sad fact of life. So the Jews then started rescuing themselves. And to do that, they had to operate undercover, like spies, I suppose, like agents. They had to work undercover and try and get these Jews out. Now, of course, they've been doing that for a very long time. So they were very experienced in that, but they did need help. And in the story, anyway, it is SOE, the wartime saboteur group, which Winston Churchill started. I will say a few words about that as well when we get to the details. Anyway, there's a fellow there called Vincent Paul, codename Granola, and he's parachuted into France. He meet up with this nun, which turns out not to be a nun, and she had a codename of Sapphire, and she She actually works for the Jewish army, and between the two of them, they are trying to rescue and smuggle a whole group of Jewish children out into Switzerland. Now, yeah, we will talk about this swine. As you know, I have no time for Switzerland whatsoever. And unlike many of you, I actually lived in the damn place. So my opinions are absolutely based on what I witnessed, what I saw, and of course I know history. Which means, of course, that I know all the shenanigans, the fact that they are really trying to hide. It's a very anti-Semitic country. It's not me saying so, it's a Jewish organizations, I think the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League or something like that. Now, lots of people see them as racist too. Whether they are or not, I'm quoting their statistics, and they will tell you that 1 out of every 4, which means 25% of the Swiss or the swine, can be considered anti-Semitic. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting, isn't it? And I would say it's more than that, actually, what I've noticed, what I've seen. They're just not nice people, and it comes out in this book, actually. Because when Granola, there's a code name for one of the characters, as well as Sapphire, they actually get the children across into Switzerland, and guess what? Yeah. The swine arrives and they just kick them out again. Yeah, of course. Did they do that in real life? Yeah, absolutely, yes, true. It's also revealed in the book. You can be take for granted that I reveal every dirty secret of a Swiss during that time in this book. I think there were some sort of stories that the book is not even available in Switzerland because of it. I don't know. That's a rumors which I've heard. I would be surprised because I don't think more than 10 or 20 people actually read the book, but that doesn't matter. Sometimes in life you have to come on record and you have to say what is right, and you have to make a stand, and you stand up as Martin Luther did, and basically say, here I stand. I can do no other, so help me God. And that's how I write my books. The story in it is really good, and it would be a great book for you to read, because it does reveal really a lot about the Jewish question in Europe before war and during the war and just after the war. I know that a lot of people don't like Jews. I understand why. I fully understand why. But at the same time, we shouldn't. Discrimination is never right, guys. Most of you listening to me would be South Africans. You know better than anybody else that discrimination is never right. And two wrongs doesn't make a right either. There's affirmative action and crap going on in South Africa right now, and has been going on since 1994. That does not make things right. In fact, it's making things worse. But that is by design. Also, it's totally by design. It's sad. There is a higher link to this. I'm not going to go into Oath of Evil again. If you want to know what's the higher link, go and read Oath of Evil. You have to understand that the Jews were not stupid. They did realize that unless they can escape Nazi Germany as well as other parts of Europe, they would be killed. They fully understood that. And the question is where would they go to? Because it was David Irving, who is a great historian, a guy who wrote many, many books on that period of time as well. I think of his book, Hitler's War, is one of the great books. But he later was totally discredited because he was accused of being a Holocaust denier, and then he sued a Jewish liberal professor, I'm not even going to mention that name, for defamation. He lost that case. But it was he who actually said in one of his books, and it struck me his comment, that he said that the Jews had asked themselves why nobody wanted them. I don't want to get into the argument, is that anti-Semitic or not? I don't know, actually. It can be, or it cannot be. It depends on how you say it and what you mean by that. It's not something I would say. But there's a good question about that, because history actually backs it. History backs it, and I look in this book in great detail on what happens to how they were trying to escape and get out, and they couldn't. But let's start at the beginning. I made some notes. And I want to read the oath of the Jewish army for you. It was a Zionist resistance movement. Now, the word Zionist these days, of course, is a dirty word. For the liberals and a lot of people listening here, probably not, I don't know. But for a lot of people, a Zionist is something evil. I've had some people on my show on Legacy Conversations explaining to us what Zionism means. According to them, it's basically just to have a homeland for Jews where they can go and be safe. But you get different, I suppose, kinds of Zionists. I mean, you get the radical type and then you get the more normal type. And the radical ones are really something else. But again, I don't want to get into those discussions. It's not important to the book. Anyway, yes, they oath. This is what they said. And each of them, and there were about 2,000 of them, they had to take this oath. They said, I swear fidelity to the Jewish army and obedience to its leaders. May my people live again. May Eretz Israel be reborn. Liberty or death. Yeah, well, that's to the point, isn't it? And as I said, there had more than 2,000 members, and they were helping Jews to escape, mostly to Spain, via the Pyrenees, through those mountains. They were getting them out via there. And the story has never really been told. In fact, I mentioned this to a few Israelis, and they didn't even know about it. That shows you how the history was buried. And I know why. And if you can't figure it out, I'll tell you why. Because they're still doing it. They're still helping Jews to escape and get out of the countries. So basically, that's the story. Now, I want to go to where SOE was actually created. When Winston Churchill took over, he did quite a few things in 1940. Now, I have no time for Winston Churchill. Anybody who listened to me and read my books will know that I rate the man lower than snake. Excrement on the bottom of a sea. I think he's a damn shyster and a drunk, and a 53-degree Freemason and a war criminal who should have been hanged a long time ago. He should have been executed during the Boer War, where he was shooting at Boers while he was a non-combatant. He was actually a reporter or something, even though, of course, he was a reserve officer in one of the posh regiments. Yeah, man, it's quite funny to see pictures of Winston Churchill those days, because he was a fine-looking young man. He was not as fat and grossly obese like he became later. In fact, he was just a normal, fit young officer at some stage. But he came out of privilege and wealth, of course. And he was always meant to be a politician, and a good shyster, that I have to say too. Even he said that he changed ranks about 3 times, which is some kind of a record. That's true. And during the Boer War, he was on a train. The train got attacked by the Boers, and he started shooting back at them. He was captured, taken prisoner. For some reason, he wasn't executed. He should have been. Would have been a great thing if he was, but he wasn't. And then he escaped, and he swam the mighty Apis River, which I urinated across many times. It's not that great, and he ain't mighty. And he made his way all the way to Lorenzo Marx, the Maputo of today. Everybody thought he was this great hero. Yeah, which he was in his own eyes. Of course, he wrote the books. He also said that, he said that I will come out very well in this war, because I will write the history. Yeah, he did. And the way he writes is fantastic, man. He wrote fantastically well. But he was as corrupt as shite. In this book, you will find out that at one stage, I think in 1938, about there, he was about to lose his house. A very big house, totally unnecessary, more like a mansion than anything else. And there was a Jewish businessman from South Africa, from the Union of South Africa, actually, who bailed him out. Yeah, it was corruption. And just before that, in the 1920s, he was very anti-Semitic, actually. Yeah, he was. He wrote such letters to the newspapers. And then suddenly something changed, and he became a Zionist supporter. Yeah. The old shekel, no, money talks, he changed his mind. It's funny, you see it to this very day. You look at the second beast of the Bible, the USA, and you look at Congress and you see how they go to Congress as normal people, not that rich. And guess what, guys? 2, 3, 5, 6 years later, wow, they're multimillionaires. How did that happen? Yeah. Now suddenly they got shares in all the military-industrial complex companies. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Huh? It's like this Billy Goat Clinton and Hilarious. They left, according to themselves in the books which they wrote, they left the White House virtually broke. Yeah. Guess what? They're worth dozens of millions now, if not hundreds of millions. What about this Pelosi? What's her name? Pelosi. Probably the best investor you've seen in your life. Why? I think she made $113 million US in the time which she spent in Congress, which was very long, about 40 years, at least 50 years probably. But still, what a fantastic insight, eh? Yeah. It's corruption, guys. It's all what it comes down to. You can buy any politician, you can buy any person, everybody's got a price. It might not be money, it might be something else. It might be the love of a good woman. It might be, for certain people, a young boy or pedophilia or whatever. But everybody's got a price. Everyone's got a price. You just need to find it. Yeah, I'm very cynical. But anyway, he did a couple of things when he actually took over. This Churchill idiot. In the first place, he attacked, he realized that he needed the US. He needed the US to come and bail them out. And so he wanted to show to them that Britain, who was not alone, by the way, England was not alone. I discuss it in this book as well. What about the entire Commonwealth nations? Yeah. What about India? Yeah. What about South Africa, Rhodesia, Jamaica, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Nigeria? What more? I can mention 100 nations to you here. But no, England was all alone. But then he made that speech, we will fight on the beaches. We will never surrender. Do you know his wife, Clement, is her name? Now, that was a good woman, was actually very pleased to be married to a guy like that. She actually made a comment. It's also known if you research about it. She actually made a comment that when he made that speech in the House of Commons, people actually laughed at him. We were like, what the hell? The war is over, man. We lost. We're not going to, what we going to do? And but he made that speech not for anybody but the US market. And then he realized that the US is still not falling for his scams. Yeah, it's fascinating now that I think about it. This Zelensky fellow, is he not doing the same? They call him the second Churchill. I mean, it's such an insult, but they don't know it. Also trying to get the West to fight his war for him against Russia. Yeah, we'll see if that happens. Well, up to now it did happen, so perhaps he is a second Churchill. But anyway, so Churchill decided he needs to show that, that the British military is still very powerful, which they were not. They had a good navy going. They had a good air force up to a point. And we will speak about Douglas Bader in this book as well. It's very fascinating. And so he attacked the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir. Now you have to understand that France was actually the leading military of the day. That's before the Blitzkrieg took them out in 1940. You also have to understand that France lost more men in those 6 weeks of fighting there than that Britain actually lost the British army during the entire 6 years of war. Yeah? So who was fighting? Read Codename Caribbean. I do discuss that, as well as the attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir. I do discuss it in great detail in that book. But I also mention it here, because why? The French fleet is now like former allies. They are now on peacetime. They are not at war stations anymore. They are lying anchored at Mers el-Kebir. The Royal Navy arrives and gives them an ultimatum. They either surrender, or they disarm themselves, or they go over to a neutral port and they stay there to be interned. Why? Why was Churchill so scared of a French fleet? Because if a French fleet combined with the Italian fleet and the German fleet, there were every chance in the book that they would overcome the Royal Navy. Have they done that? And they could have. Have they done that, they would have gotten over the channel, the English channel that is. They would have invaded Britain and everybody would be speaking the language of royals. That's German. It's German. Because the English royal are actually not English. They are actually German. They come from Germany. They had to change their name in 1917, I believe, to the House of Windsor, because up to then it was just one long horrible German name. Yeah, many people don't know that. We do know, they don't want to remember it. So he attacked the French fleet at Mers el Kabir, and more than 1,106, I think, some say 1,400 sailors actually died of the French Navy. They tried to fight back, but you need to maneuver. You want to fight a war. And of course, they tied, in the harbor, the anchors are dropped, everything. They tied to the quays or the jetties or whatever you want to call it. And so the Royal Navy scored one of the few victories there. Even the commander of the Royal Navy, I quote it in this book, says it was the most disgusting thing. It was totally unnecessary. It should never have happened, and they should be ashamed. Damn right, you should be ashamed, you know. And it very closely came at Vichy France when declared war on Britain. And as I said, if they've done that and joined arms with the Nazis, man, history would have looked very, very different today than what it looks like now. So this Churchill, that's one of the things he did. One of the other things he did is within days of taking over, he signed papers which made sure that every person who is suspected to be a Nazi sympathizer, and many of them were basically arrested and kept under arrest until 1945, late 44. So for the next 4 or 5 years, they were kept basically in jail without any court hearing, without any habeas corpus, nothing. He just suspended the law. Yeah, he did that. Nobody remembers that either, but I know about it. But then on the 13th of June 1940, Lord Hankey persuaded the Section D and military intelligence that the operation should be coordinated. That was on the command of Winston Churchill. So then on July the 1st, this is 1940, a cabinet-level meeting arranged for formation of a single sabotage organization. And then Hugh Dalton, the Minister of Economic Warfare, he was then appointed to take care of this. And so this organization was formed on 22nd July 1940. And that is where Special Operations Executive came into being. Now, it's very, very important because, that is actually the model which the CIA then followed. It was not really MI6. MI6 was there, but MI6, and it's also in this book, has a very bad war. When Germany overran all these countries, they had no agents left in place. And so they were basically then focusing only on code breaking and coding. And if you read my book, Codename Udette, we really go into what's the difference between a code and a cipher. And it's also a book where I give a warning that modern Western intelligence is infiltrated by, let's call them jihadi sympathizers. Yes, they are there. Actually describe an incident which took place in the book anyway in Nigeria. In real life, it was a different country. But it basically played out as it played out. And so they became known as the guys controlling Enigma. And that's the only damn claim to fame. Besides that, they did nothing. Why MI6 wasn't disbanded in disgrace after the war and during the war is an open wonder to know. They had a really bad war. They were not nearly as good as they said afterwards. And they cost the lives of many, many SOE agents, especially in the Netherlands, which I will also talk about. And then this new organization had a lot of other problems as well, because the military wouldn't really support them. The military, straightforward people, they don't really like the spies. They do value intelligence. They are clever. They would do that. But SOE to get into occupied France and other places really had problems. Unlike the Americans, which came later in the form of OSS, they never really had the aircraft or logistical means. They were well trained. The agents were well trained. They could do the job, but to get into the country was a bit of a problem. And I want to quote something to you from Air Chief Marshal Charles Porter, who's a famous Royal Air Force officer and a good one. But he was old-fashioned. He didn't think in the terms which SOE would be thinking about. Now, you see that, even in my time in the shadows, you see that as well. There is a bit of a feeling between the two groups. As much as the intelligence is valued, they don't really like the idea of people doing what these saboteurs were planning to do. And here what they were planning was to drop onto German airbase in occupied France and kill all the pilots. Yeah, it was a night fighter base, and they wanted to get all of them, just line them up and kill them. Now, if you do that with your commandos or special forces, it's not a war crime, you can do it. But if you do that with your spies, yes, that's actually a crime. So Air Chief Marshal Charles Porter said, I think that the dropping of men dressed in civilian clothes for the purpose of attempting to kill members of opposing forces is not an operation which the Royal Air Force should be associated with. I think you will agree that there is a vast difference in ethics between the time-honored operation of dropping a spy from the air and this entirely new scheme for dropping what one can only call assassins. Well, the Marshal is correct. He's totally correct. That's the way it was. And so they had a lot of problems to get themselves dropped into occupied France. So they're starting using boats as well. But let us speak about something which happened in the Netherlands. You have to understand what was happening here is that SOE had no real spy networks or anything in the country which they wanted to penetrate and infiltrate. And what also made them very different from special forces, and that is the difference between the spies and special forces, is that special forces normally goes in and they get out. They don't stay on. In other words, they would attack a target, destroy the target, and they would get out back to safety. It's quick operations, mostly. In this sense of the word, where you talk about sabotage. I'm not talking where they're training people behind enemy lines and things like that. That's not what I'm talking about. But with the spies, it's different. They would jump in almost naked, meaning that they don't know anybody there, but they can speak the language, and they might know a few people from pre-war days who I think can be trusted, which is, of course, a very, very well, that's a leap of faith, right? But anyway, they would jump blind into these countries and they would parachute in, and then they would walk around, establish themselves, they had fake money, real money, meet up with mates, start recruiting people for their spy networks. But all of that doesn't really help unless you can report back to the home nation, is it? You have to be able to report. And the way they reported was by way of radio. And the Germans were not stupid. They knew about that. And it is something which happens in this book as well. So that's why I spent some time with it. So you understand the dangers that these people face. It's incredibly brave people. I mean, I would say more than half of the female agents anyway who jumped into France, occupied France. All of them died. They discussed in this book as well. Many were captured, many ended up in concentration camps, many were executed in the last days of the war. Fantastically brave women, some tried to shoot their way out and got killed. And of course, when you do get captured, you definitely will get abused. Now, there's no known incidents where these female captives were actually raped by the Germans anyway. That is one of those strange things which never, I don't know if it's suppressed, if it happened. I would have believed it would have happened, but there's no evidence of that actually. They would have been abused in other ways. I mean, they would have been starved, whipped, beaten. Um, one specific one, Odette Churchill, she had the toenails removed, just pulled out. Uh, all sorts of things happened to them, but rape was really never part of it. And by that I mean from the upward or military intelligence people. I'm not saying it could not have happened in the concentration camp, but some of these concentration camps actually had whorehouses, can I put it like that? And many of the women inside them were, of course, not there because they wanted to be there. Many of them were from the Eastern Europe, Russians, things like that. And if you read Codename 1 Alpha, there's where we write about white slavery or human trafficking and the link of terrorism today or modern times. And you will find out that most of these women who are ending up in strip clubs and whorehouses and places like that and are trafficked, most of them actually comes from Eastern Europe, a large part also from North Korea. But you can go and look at the figures. But I actually do have pictures here, which I got when I was doing research, of a woman having a tattoo on her chest. I'll put it on for you here if I can find it. Standing Camp War or something like that. It's tested. It's tattooed on her. It's dreadful. It's also like this tattoo which the Jews had on their arm. Not all of them, by the way. That's the other fascinating thing which came out from this book is only certain camps had that, not all the camps. And it wasn't tested on the Jews first. It was tested on about 200 Russian army prisoners of war, Soviet army. And they took some nails. I might even have pictures of this. It looks like a block of wood with nails. And then they just basically hammered it into the guy's chest. The brutality of the Germans are just amazing. You cannot read this book without feeling sympathy, man. You have to feel sympathy. This was just dreadful times. That's where that comes from. Very, very interesting. It's these small things which comes out, which is to me fascinating in the book, as well as there was one guy who rescued children, and how he got him across the border with a swine, because the swine guards will start shooting if you approach their country and you look like you want to invade them, or, well, invasion is not the right word, but you want to cross the border. It's well known that they actually started shooting at the Jews. It's known. It's history. So what this guy would do is he would take a soccer ball. It's also in the book, and he would tell the children, which was young, from 6 years to 12, 15 perhaps, and tell them just to dribble that soccer ball and just dribble it across the border. And once across the border, just ask for amnesty and contact the Jewish organizations in Zurich or Bern or wherever, which they did more than once. Of course, the problem was there were landmine fields, which they had to clear first. There's even one guy who was a police head in one of the cantons, and he let the Jews in. Yeah, they hammered him. He went to jail. Yeah. There were 30,000 Jews who actually had not the right paperwork. They were turned back. Yeah, by the swine. Yes, them. And all of them died. They disappeared. Yeah. If you talk to the Swiss, they're so proud. They're so very proud of how they helped the Jews. No. There were a lot of tens of thousands they didn't help. We do speak about that question in this book. We do discuss it. As I always say to you, when these characters start speaking in any of my books, you can listen to what they say. And Sapphire comes up for the swine, but she does say that, look, they did rescue many. They're very grateful for that, but they didn't rescue all of them. And they were not neutral during the war either. We speak about that as well. But anyway, back to the Netherlands and how it worked in occupied France and the rest of occupied Europe. To stay in contact, they could either use pigeons, which they used to this very day, and of course airborne forces used a lot of pigeons homing pigeons. They would put little messages on them. Pigeon fly back, go to its cage. The pigeon farmer will capture the bird, take the message to military intelligence, and there it goes. But as you can think, that is not a very reliable way of doing it, and it's slow, and it's just not a good idea. The other problem they had is their codes were broken, because MI6 knew virtually F all about codes. They they were so arrogant, they MI6, they know everything. They've got the Enigma code breakers. Yeah, they did. The code, what government and encryption school or whatever fell on them. But at the end of the day, their codes were easily broken, and they were broken, and many spies died because of it. And because of that, SOE then started changing to their own codes. They started using one-time pad codes, which you also use these days when you do banking transactions. And they send you a code which you have to type in again. That's a one-time pad code. Can't be broken. Unless, of course, you're at the receiving end and you know which code is going to be sent. But it's very hard to break it. But all codes can be broken. Read code name Udet. You will find that out. But anyway, so we were using these radios, and so we had females mostly who were radio operators, and it was technology-wise fantastic. They could fit this two-way radio waves into a suitcase, and they would jump with us. The suitcase was radio, and they would then set it up somewhere, and they would broadcast out. But the wire antenna was about 59 feet. That's 18 meters long. And it had to be attached somewhere. So it was really not like a cell phone, it was very hard. And then the radio itself had three parts. It had a transmitter, a receiver, and it had spare parts with it. In the beginning, they didn't have batteries for them. They simply didn't have the technology. So what happened is they would link it to the electrical grid. And what would then happen is the Germans would start switching it off by neighborhood. And then they hear these radios because they could listen to the beep, beep, beep of the Morse code. And then they suddenly goes dead and they know, wow, okay, it must have been in that neighborhood because we got the power there. Yeah, and then they would use homing vehicles which would travel around and they would just home onto the signal. And then they arrest these people, sometimes while transmitting, and they would, of course, they can get hold of a radio. Then you're in deep trouble, because then they can actually start playing games, radio games. And this is exactly what happened. Also, I just want to say before I carry on with that, is that technology when changed, they started using batteries on the radios, and that sort of nullified the cutting of electricity. So London would be listening in on these messages coming in. Mostly it would be reporting back, technical intelligence, or it would be requesting arms or food or whatever, because these guys were out there creating sabotage groups. And they would then raid the Germans and keep them off balance. Now, it's fascinating how that worked as well. Before an agent would be dropped, he would be thoroughly searched to make sure that he doesn't have anything on him which in a search can show that he's British, or he comes from across the pond, or wherever he's coming from, or across the channel. Those searches weren't done that well. But most of all, the damn problem was that there were sloppiness and carelessness at SOE headquarters. There was one captured female operator. What they would do is they would capture the radio as well as the operator. And then they had like a code which the operator would make a deliberate mistake in the code. She would send a message through, but she makes a mistake somewhere which she planned and was discussed to show that she's under enemy control. Now, many of them, more than one of them, actually did send this code out to say that she's under enemy control. But guys, you should remember this. Here's this female, right? She's a spy. She's an agent. She parachuted into France. She operated there for a while. Now she's captured by the Germans. She's being abused. Then she, after a while, she says, okay, she will send messages on their behalf. which of course is a message to bring more weapons and things in, to make contact with other agents, to have more agents jump in so that they can capture them as well. You can see where this is heading. It's the utter betrayal. So she says, okay, she will do it after being beaten and abused and blah, blah, blah. And now she's doing there and she's sending the message and she's making the deliberate mistake, knowing that the Germans are going to kill her if they find out. They're going to kill her because they know about this way of doing it. And guess what happens is head of section head for France. It is a guy called Maurice Buckmaster. I think he also wrote a few books. I think he was a colonel. A flippin' idiot of note. He's an imbecile. I mean, you know what he replied to her? He said he sent a message back. She made a mistake and she should be more careful in the future. Bingo, bingo. Executed 5 minutes later. There you go. There you go. You know, it's just. The guy was also totally, because of his stupidity and lack of care for the agents in the field, he was the one who was absolutely responsible for the Paris-based Prosper circuit. It was a spy network failure and implosion. I mean, the guy's an idiot. And in Netherlands, it went so far that they captured the first guys, or they captured some of them. They started playing these radio games. They started sending these messages. The SOE members in headquarters absolutely didn't notice it. They didn't bother that they were getting these messages that the guys were under enemy control. And so they kept on sending weapons and new agents, these guys, and the weapons would be captured. Some of the explosives captured like that was used to try and kill Hitler during the 1944 attempt. Yeah, that's where that came from. And we do discuss where plastic explosives actually come from in this book as well. It's very fascinating. But then there was a guy called Leo Marx. Now, if you can ever read his book, I think it's Between Silk and Cyanide. It's a fantastic book. He was at SOE. He was a code breaker and a code maker. He's the one who wrote that fantastic poem for his late fiancée or someone who died during war service. And he wrote this poem, a very, very famous poem, which he wrote for her, which was being used by another spy who got captured and executed, Violet Spishby or something. I never can say the woman's name. I apologize. She jumped in. She used this poem as a code, and they say that she was the most beautiful SOE female operator ever. I personally think that Odette Churchill was much better looking. But that doesn't matter. And the funny thing about Violet is also she was a fantastic shot. So she tried to shoot her way out. And Violet, during a parachute jump, hurt her ankle. And so a training jump. And so when she went into France and she got trapped, she started shooting her way out because she couldn't run her way out. And that's why she got captured and then executed later. But this Leo Marx, anyway, picked up that there was something wrong with the messages coming in from the Netherlands, in the sense that they never repeated them and they were always perfect. In other words, the agents sending them were not under pressure, because by this time, it wasn't the agents anymore. It would be a German operator of this Morse code, and he would just simulate as if he is the other guy at the same speed. They were quite good at that, you know. And then he realized these messages just come in without any interference. And then he became very suspicious. And at one stage, he actually sent HH back, which stands for Heil Hitler. And he got the message back HH. Now that is how the Germans in those days were ending the letters. It was not like with love or sincerely or yours truly. It was always HH. And that's how he caught them. And still, we didn't listen to him. They didn't listen to him. And you wouldn't believe some of these agents from the Netherlands actually escaped. And they made their way back to England, probably through Spain or Portugal or one of these countries. And they got there and they explained that the entire network in the Netherlands is under German control. which by that time they had 18 radios under control, and they wouldn't believe him. In fact, these Dutch officers were were then locked up, and they were just removed from society, not murdered, but put in a place of safety where they couldn't talk anymore. Yeah, that's a guy called Richard Lemming and the Major Charles Blizzard. Not their real names, the names they used. They were ones who actually didn't notice these things, who didn't want to notice these things. And guess what? They were promoted after the war. It is amazing. It is absolutely amazing. So 4 years after the war, in 1949, there was a judicial inquiry in the Dutch parliament about what happened. They appointed Dr. Donker. I suppose you can translate that to blacker or more black or something like that from Dutch, to investigate this. And he did it very well. He did it so well, in fact, that they that whatever he had to say was suppressed. And then, would you believe, in 1946, 3 years before that, but a year after the war, all the Dutch documents of the Dutch section, yeah, it got burnt out in a fire, which mysteriously broke out in the SOE headquarters in London. Yeah. There's Leo Marx. He said, I've worked too long for SOE to believe that this fire was accidental. Damn right he was. These people in the background, they're just effing up and leaving these agents in the lurch. It's a dreadful thing. It's a dreadful thing when that happens. And in this book, this threat is always hanging on granola as well as on sapphire. They're fully aware of the fact that they can be betrayed from England. And so it's just one of these things which added. Then I quickly want to talk about something about how the Jews were trying to escape before the war. I think it's very, very important to know that. I don't know if you people know about the story about the St. Louis. And that's a ship. The motor skiff, in other words, a motorized ship, the St. Louis. It was an ocean liner and it left Germany with 900 Jewish refugees on. They actually got permission from the Germans just to piss off and to go away. And so they left. And man, they were happy. They were so happy when they left. There's actually pictures of them dancing there on the decks. I mean, because this is 1938. Hitler has been in charge there for, they were in charge now for 5 years already. It's actually 1939, forgive me. So in 1939, the ship leaves with 900 Jews aboard. They've escaped Europe now. They're so happy. They're going to Cuba. They're going to wherever. So this liner then goes to Cuba, where they've already paid. They paid for that. They also paid the Cubans to get there, to be accepted in Cuba, but Cuba tells them to go away. So they deny them permission to disembark. So the liner then sails to the US. Guess what? US tells them to piss off. They don't want them. Canada, yeah, Canadians, huh? Yeah. Isn't that the country which applauded this Nazi member about 2 years ago? You know, the one there who murdered Jews. Yeah, in Parliament. Justin Trudeau and the other mommy's boys were in the Canadian Parliament. Didn't they applaud this Nazi? Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. Yeah, they were standing there it's amazing. I didn't think I would ever see that of Canada, but yeah, oh Canada, what happened to you? I think of the truckers, yeah. Not a nice place to be the West anymore, let me tell you. But in 1939, Canada also told us 900 Jews to piss off. Yeah, told them like that. Bad language, I know, but that's what they told them. Both of these countries denied them entry. Nobody wanted them. So we returned to Europe. You can imagine what was going through those Jews' mind when they were sailing back to Europe. Now they know the Nazis are waiting for them. So they ended up in some in the UK, very few. Most ended up in Belgium, in Netherlands, and France. And then came a year later, the Blitzkrieg. And now these countries are overrun. What do you think happened to those Jews? Huh? Yeah, they all went to the concentration camps, all of them died. That's it, they died. In fact, the St. Louis voyage became known as the Voyage of the Damned. There might even be a movie made about it. I also talk often about in 1946-47, after the Jews are now rescued out of the European camps, and most of them were actually rescued by the Soviet army, they make their way to Palestine. They want to start a new life. They don't want to stay in Europe anymore. Can bloody well understand why. And now they charter these ships, they charter these old not warships, merchant ships, and they're trying to make their way there. In fact, if you read the second book, where does it end? The second book, so where Granola and Sapphire teams up again, but this time they want to rescue a couple of 100 Jews, and it did happen. It's based upon a real story. But you can't smuggle a couple of 100 people out of a country that easily, so they meet up with a merchant ship which then sails towards Palestine. But those ships, a few years later, would all be captured, basically by the Royal Navy. Yes, here you go. And then they would be taken to Cyprus, and they would be held in camps there as well. Yeah. To a Voyage of the Damned. In 2012, the US formally apologized. I apologized for that. In May of 2018, Canada also offered a formal apology to what they did. But let's see what happened in 1938. There was a conference in a place called Evian. That's on the French side of Lake Geneva. I often looked at the place across from where we were at Lausanne. You look across the lake, and to the left there would be Evian. Now that's also where Evian water comes from, and Evian actually takes plays quite a role in this book. In fact, part of the book plays off in Evian as well as in Lausanne, simply because I lived in Lausanne and I knew the place. And I'll say that to you about Lausanne. I saw a lot of the terrorist jihadis, which I was hunting in sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah, I saw a lot of them selling drugs there on the streets of Lausanne. Yeah, sometimes we would look at each other and just smile and walk past each other. We declared neutrality. I don't care if I attack the Swiss, couldn't give a shite. Yeah, I would, in fact, if I knew about such an attack, I will not warn the Swiss at all. And that's your problem in counter-terrorism. The moment that people become positively neutral to one side, in the sense that they say, I will not help you. Nah, I'm neutral, I don't care. You're in big trouble. We saw that in Rhodesia as well. They were running pseudo-operations with their Selous Scouts, and they quickly found out that the tribesmen were not reporting the presence of the Selous Scouts, which the tribesmen would have fought the genuine terrorists. And that's probably when you can make the deduction that you've lost the war. The moment that you lose people who are supposed to report to you and they say, I won't do it, I'm not going to do it, I don't like you, I don't care if you die, bingo, you've lost that war. Wake up, swine, wake up. You cannot afford that. But anyway, in 1938, a big conference was held at Evian, and they wanted to talk about Jewish refugees. Because the entire Europe could see that there's a problem brewing with the Jewish people and the Jews, and they're going to get killed. This was not that nobody knew about it. No, all the signs were there, guys. They were there. Even though the mass exterminations only started in about 1942, 43, 44. And I'm not a Jewish scholar. It's just what the research told me and what, I spoke to many people about it, the survivors, when I wrote the books. They knew there was something going to happen. And if people say to you, well, we don't think it's 6 million, well, you can't prove it's 6 million. They got the figure from one of the camp commanders, I think at Auschwitz, and we do go into great detail about Auschwitz and the extermination camps and the other camps, Birkenhead or something, Birkenau, and we go into detail. We describe that in the book as well. It's very, very fascinating Jewish history. I mean, it's really it's worth your while to read. But not all camps, of course, were extermination camps. But one of the heads where after the war said they killed about 6 million. That's where that comes from. Whether it was 6 million or 5.9 or 6.1, who the hell cares? The fact is, we were killing people there at a mass scale in the concentration camps, not only Jews, of course, there were other people also being murdered, and there is no excuse. So they knew about these things. They knew that these things were going to happen. There is no excuse, really, there's no excuse. So 32 countries actually attended this conference at Evian, and they expressed much sympathy. But only one country was actually willing to accept large numbers of it. Which one? Which country do you think would accept large numbers of Jews? Italy? No, of course not. Italy was a fascist state at that time. And Italy, under Mussolini, is the one who restored the first beast of the Bible, the papacy, the Vatican. It was a 1,260-day prophecy which played out. Read Oath of Evil, the Warn Protestantism. Then read further that the cardinals and the Pope of that day actually said that their preferred system is actually the, what do I hear? Fascist system. Yeah, that's what they want. That's what they had in the Middle Ages. That's damn well what they're going to have now in the last days as well. Fascinating how these things get together. And then you think of a Catholic Church who actually helped so many Nazis to escape. Yeah, after the war. Why is that? Why? Also, do you know that virtually every single dictator in the world, I can put a list for you here, every single one of them says, what do I hear? Catholic. Yeah. I don't hate Catholics. I don't want to be sure when I say that to you. I'm talking about a system which I believe is sun worship. It's from Satan because the Bible says so. End of story. And if you don't believe me, read Oath of Evil where I explain it in great detail. But yeah, they did that. They helped a lot of Nazis to escape. So did the US, by the way, Operation Paperclip. Yeah. So did the Soviets, by the way. They also captured many scientists. But anyway, there's only one country in the entire world who said they are welcome. It's not the US, by the way. It's not Britain. No. Dominican Republic. Yeah. Dominican Republic. It's in South America. Many people don't even know where it is. They offered to take in 100,000 refugees. Yeah. And it's not a big country. It's as big as New Hampshire in the US. It's a small place. The USA, despite this conference being called by Franklin Delano Roosevelt a 33-degree Freemason, well, they didn't even send an official representative. Why would they? And they would limit the Jewish immigration to about 50,000 a year. Practically, that was about 40,000. And in the 6 years between 39 and 1945, the US got about 250,000 Jews in. So that's why I say it's more to 41,000 perhaps. The Philippines, they also wanted as many Jews as possible. That's what they asked for. But the Philippines at that stage were what? What were they? American colony? Yes, they were that. They still are, by the way. And so they were limited to 1,000 Jews. You know, it is... When you start thinking we're talking about human beings here, we're talking about people like you and me who can feel, who can laugh, who can get ill, who can be healthy, who can make laugh, who can have happy feelings, who can make food, who can dance, who can talk, write books. And they just auctioned up your slaves. Okay, guys, you know what? Yeah, we know you're going to die, all these millions of you. And yeah, we at the Philippines, man, please come. We want you here. We know you have skills. But no, our masters in Washington, D.C. says only 1,000. So which 1,000? Which thousand? You understand the problem here. If you don't understand, then I can't explain it better. The UK said 50,000. That's what they wanted a year. Australia agreed to 5,000 a year. France, what's interesting, is the country outside the Middle East with the most Jews. Said it was already saturated. They don't want any Jews whatsoever. Okay, that was their way of thinking. The other place in the world where there's the most Jews is New York. So why do you think when New York World Trade Center was attacked? Why? Why? Why do you think Paris was attacked in 2015? Why? Why? Simply because there's so many Jews there. Now, please, I'm not anti-Semitic when I say that. I'm telling you straightforward from a counter-terrorism viewpoint. That is the view which we hold in counter-terrorism, is why those places were big targets and still is today big targets, because there's so many Jews there. That is also why Israel is attacked, because there's so many Jews there. So don't tell me I'm something which I'm not. I will bloody well sue you. But yeah, that's what happened. So history will tell you that 75,000 Jews, including many children, were deported from France to the camps. That is after France, of course, fell. After Britain ran away at Dunkirk, you remember? Yeah, you ran away. You ran. You dropped your weapons and you ran away. And you can tell me whatever the hell you want. Fact is, you ran. And you left all your weapons behind. Yes. And you had an agreement with France. You will go back. Yes, the Royal Navy and whoever else can come and rescue us. And we will rescue the French soldiers who are actually fighting the rear guard, not you. Yes. Go and read Montgomery's books, his memoirs. He was actually in command at one stage of falling back when the senior officers were leaving and he was left there. And yeah, go and read. We know history. And you ran away. And you were supposed to go back. But then what happened? Tell me what happened. Oh, no, you never went back. Never. 4 years later, you went back under the command of Eisenhower, an American. By that time, there were 38 or 39 American and Canadian soldiers for every one Brit. It's pathetic, man. Come and tell me you were all alone. That is why France surrendered, you idiot. That's why he surrendered. Because you dropped him, you, the UK. You were the ones who refused to go back and fight. Why? Because you couldn't. You dropped all your weapons and you ran away. You had no weapons. You were issuing your soldiers with forks and things. And then you want to tell me here that you would have defeated the German army if they came across that channel. Then tell me, why did you have plans to flee all the way to Canada? Huh? Tell me that. Because you knew. So you can write the history the way you want. But there's a lot of us who actually know the truth about you and how you ran away. And you also have to explain to me in the second time I say this, why did you have almost no casualties in the Second World War? Why? Why did France suffer almost 2 million men in losses in that 6 weeks? And you, how much was it? 480,000 or something in the entire war. Huh? Because you weren't fighting. That's why. Because you were using the Commonwealth nations, India, South Africa, Rhodesia, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, lots of them. You were using them to fight on your behalf. Yes, that's what you were doing. And this comes out in many of my books. And if you think I'm angry about it, yes, I am. Because all I hear these days is, oh, look at France. Oh, the French tanks, they have 5 reverse gears. You know what is the standard issue to France, to the French army? White flags. Yeah, really. It's so wrong. Even your hero Churchill said, don't judge what happened in 1940. You weren't there. Even your hero Churchill said in Parliament many times, go and read, do some research. Thank God for the French army. Why would he say that? Thank God for the French army. And yet you sit and you still want to tell your revised history of what happened there. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, the Union of South Africa said they will only allow people in with Jews in. This is at 1938 at Evian. They will only allow people in who is actually a close family of the Jews already in South Africa. So let's put this in context to you. There were about 16.6 million Jews in the world in 1938-39, roughly speaking. 57% of them, or 9.5 million, were found in Europe. That's why 6 million were killed. And they were in mortal danger. And people knew this. That's why the damn conference was taking place. And the British Empire, I already mentioned South Africa, they followed London's lead because they had no choice. And so a few thousand only went by boat to the Caribbean, but they would not be allowed. Really, they were kept there. They were kept there. So the Jews, being clever people, they realized that in Trinidad there were no visa requirements. They only had to pay like a deposit when they land there. So they got 600 of these Jews, European Jews, actually landed in Trinidad. Many of them were actually professionals. There was one who was a physician, a doctor, a lady doctor. And she had to work as a midwife. Another one turned to be a chemist. And there was a master builder. There's lawyers. The lawyers started working as a canvasser. Some opened jewelry stores. Point I'm trying to make is the Jews who arrived there were not lazy people. They were not standing there and say, please give us handouts. No. They arrived and they said, give us a chance, guys. We will work. We don't mind working. And they were paying their dues. And yet nobody wanted them. Some of the locals, they wrote, and this is the white people writing this now in Trinidad. They're saying Trinidad is a dumping ground for Jews. The place is so congested already. Yet the foreigners are pouring in every day. Is that anti-Semitic? Yeah? Yeah, these people, they're all children of God. Doesn't matter if they're Jews, doesn't matter if they're Muslims, doesn't matter whatever. All created in the image of God, your Father, even you. And guess what? You don't want it. No. When they arrive and, it's like, there's so many of them already. They're filthy Jews. They got overrun our clubs. Anyway, in Evian, even though a conference took place, and if you go to Evian today, there is like monuments there for that. It really showed that there was no real tolerance. They just didn't care. They just didn't care. Who's saying that? Let's read. In 1984, there was a guy called Walter Mondale. He was a Democrat, a Democratic Party. I call them Democrats. He was a presidential hopeful. I'm not sure who he ran against. Probably Reagan. He lost. But he was also a vice president, of course, under Jimmy Carter. And he said in 1979, and he's talking about Evian now, he says, at stake at Evian were both human lives and the decency and self-respect of a civilized world. There you go. There you go. It's not so much about the Jews as well, it's also about those people who refused them entry. If each nation at Evian, there were 52 of them, by the way, had agreed on that day, just to take in 17,000 Jews at once, every Jew in the Reich would have been saved. Yeah, there you go. As one American observer wrote, it's heartbreaking to think of the desperate human beings waiting in suspense for what happens at Evian. But the question there on the line is simply not humanitarian. It was a test of civilization. And you, the West, you failed. End of story. You get 0 out of 10. Go and stand in the corner. Say you're sorry. Then came Dr. Chaim Weizmann. He was later the president of Israel. He was a brilliant chemist, by the way, during the First World War. He did fantastically well. And he said, at the time, the world seemed to be divided into two parts. Those places where the Jews could not live and those where they could not enter. Man, you have to think what Dr. James said here. This is shocking. I say again, let me repeat this. The world seemed to be divided into two parts. Those places where the Jews could not live, in other words, they're not welcome, And those places where they cannot enter. So they're not welcome there either. So what happens now? Jews, you're not welcome to enter here, you're not welcome to live here, let's kill you. Yeah, let's kill you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Again, we're talking of human beings here, you know. Golda Meir, one of my heroes actually, she was later the Prime Minister of the Jewish state. She's the one who said that she's the only man in the cabinet. She also said, man, you're not as great as you think you are. I just love Golda Meir. She said she was there as an observer, nothing else, because the Jews, of course, had no representation. They had no country. And she remarked about her opposition as being an observer there. She said, a ridiculous capacity of a Jewish observer from Palestine, not even seated with the delegates, although the refugees on the discussion were my own people. That's it. And she said, ridiculous. I'm there, but I can't speak. I can just observe. And then she said, there's only one thing I hope to see before I die, and that's what my people should not need any expressions of sympathy anymore. And that's the book. I can really go on and on here. I can tell you how they actually parachuted these agents into France because it happens in the book. Let me just show it to you once again because, you know, it covers so many different subjects that I can speak about this book for another 2-3 hours, but I don't want to. I think I spoke too much and I got really worked up with the Brits. I don't hate the Brits, by the way. I don't hold them in great regard either, but we should always remember where the concentration camps come from. British Army, yes, you started it. And 1/3 of my people were wiped out by you, yes. And there is some people who say, well, you know, it wasn't meant to be, but and you people arrived there by yourselves anyway. No. You caused those conditions. Therefore, legally speaking, you are responsible. Have you ever apologized like you did to the Jews? No, never, not once. You're too flippin' arrogant. And the rest of the world actually apologized to the Jews. Yeah, most of them did. How much money did the swine pay out? Let's think about it. Here in the 1990s, I really love telling this story because it's true. What happened in the 1990s is now that Billy Goat Clinton, he starts putting the squeeze on Switzerland, on Swineland, to start releasing the money they've been keeping there since the Second World War and before. The Jewish money in their banks. Yeah. They're still there, by the way. Because they said, no, we have to keep this money because these people are dead now, and unless we can know that there's really survivors or whatever, then we... So what they did is they played the red tape thing. What they would say is, yeah, we've got, say, $1 million Swiss franc here from a rich guy, a rich Jew. He's now killed in the camps, but he's got like a nephew or something, or niece, which survived. But since it's not his account and he cannot prove that this guy was dead now and cannot say it now anymore, that the money should go to this guy, we will keep the money and we'll just use it for our own investment. Yeah. There's a swine summarized for you. Exactly. Whenever we're in trouble, we fall back on red tape. And whenever that happens, it's like, don't you know that? No, how must I know it? I don't know. But you don't know. Everybody knows that. No, nobody knows that. Only flipping you know it. They're so scared. They're really scared people. It's amazing the Swiss. I was walking around there. Two occasions I really got annoyed with somebody. I just walked in to give him a bit of a hiding. And just by me walking up to him with that attitude, you just see this guy running. His eyes are this big, he doesn't know what to do. So anyway, the US were putting pressure upon them, I mean, and now they couldn't play their stupid beyond belief red tape story, so they had to pay out. So they did an investigation and they found out that at the most they had about $258 million of Swiss franc of this type of money. And then the Jews, of course, said to them, they don't think it's that, they think it's a lot more. So they got this very liberal professor or something to look at it again, and he came up with a figure of about 400 million. which was stretching it a bit according to the swine. But now I want to pay, because the US has spoken and they have to listen. After all, they are a two-bit country in the middle of the Alps. They can't live without their neighbors. And so at the end of the day, I think we paid 1.2 billion. They only paid about 3-4 times more than what they actually should have. Yeah, you see, even there, if you speak to them loudly enough, they bend down and touch their toes, and you can do with them whatever you want. That's a swine, that's their legacy. But let us not forget about the 50,000 Jews they killed by not allowing them in. Let us not forget about Switzerland when the Jews were actually arrived. Look at what Dr. Roof, that famous doctor of sexual things, which he talks about these things in New York. Let's not forget what she said also, what she said when she was in Switzerland. She escaped to Switzerland. She actually got in. Her parents got murdered in the camps. And the Swiss refused to have her go to school. Why? Because she's a young girl, 16, whatever years old. And they believed that a young girl of that age should not get any education. She should stay at home. Yeah, probably barefoot and naked in the kitchen and pregnant, Yeah. Yeah, we did that. It's not me saying it. That's what Dr. Roof says in her video, which she made, a movie. Yeah, they said that. Swiss, of course, don't remember that anymore. Dr. Roof then went to Israel. She became a sniper. She was very involved there with the fighting. And after that, she went to the US on a grant, and then we know she became quite famous. So that's the book. It's available in audio, hardcover, softcover, as well as Kindle. It's available on Amazon. You can get hold of it, please do so. It's a book which is quite suppressed. Of course, it's suppressed because there's a lot of things which the Western governments would rather want to forget. They don't want to talk about these days, and they have a lot of influence. It's a book which should be read by most people. And then, of course, there's a follow-up book, which is called Where Does It End? And I'll speak about that one a bit later. So God bless and thank you for listening.